just wanted to say it face to face," she said, her voice trembling beneath the weight of her own nerves. She bit down lightly on her lower lip, her eyes refusing to lift from the rain-damp stone beneath her feet. Her hands gripped the straps of her backpack so tightly that her fingers turned nearly white. I don't have a lot of money, but I'll find a way. I promise I'll make it right." The man let out the faintest laugh, barely more than a breath. It wasn't mocking, and it wasn't unkind. There was something oddly gentle in the sound, something that suggested a man who had once known how to be stern, but had since softened with time. "You really think I came here to ask you for money?" That was when she finally looked up. Really looked. For the first time, she allowed herself to meet his gaze. The streetlight spilled across his face, outlining the defined bridge of his nose, and the faint lines etched beside his eyes, lines that spoke more of weariness and wisdom than of wealth or wrath. This wasn't the face of someone looking to punish or intimidate. His expression held something gentler, almost moved, like someone unexpectedly touched by the sincerity of a stranger's guilt. "Not everyone," he said, his voice steady and quiet, "has the strength to admit when they've done something wrong, especially when no one's watching, when no one would have ever known." She didn't say anything, not because she didn't want to, but because part of her, a very old and hidden part of her, didn't quite know how. That part had spent years learning to be cautious, to brace for disappointment, to never assume the best of people. That part still didn't believe she deserved kindness from strangers. But the other part, the part that had written the note and stood by the car in the wind, wanted to believe him, desperately. Still, belief wasn't easy, not when you'd lived your whole life learning that apologies could be twisted, that good intentions didn't always shield you from consequences. He didn't press her for more. Instead, he looked past her, toward the empty space between the trees, where shadows stretched like long questions in the dark. "You know," he continued, more to the night than to her now, "sometimes a scratch is just where the light begins to break in." And in that moment, something in his tone shifted. It wasn't about the car anymore. It was about something deeper, something he himself had once broken, or lost, or regretted. She didn't answer, but she heard him. Really heard him. Not with her ears, but with that same part of her that had written the note with shaking hands, the part of her that still hoped even when everything else told her not to. She didn't quite understand everything he meant, but something in his tone told her the words weren't meant for her alone. They carried the heaviness of a memory, of something personal. It felt like he was speaking to the silence inside himself as much as to her. When they parted, it was wordless, no exchange of numbers, no discussion of repayment. Just a shared pause, a lingering glance, and then quiet footsteps in opposite directions. She rode her bike into the night, the cold air brushing against her skin like a hand she couldn't quite pull away from. Her chest felt lighter, not unburdened, but as if something that had been tightly wound inside her had loosened just enough to let her breathe. And yet, her mind couldn't stop looping one sentence, again and again, like a half-remembered melody. Sometimes, a scratch can be the doorway to something new. At home, she unzipped her backpack and found the first note she had written, crumpled, folded in on itself like a secret she almost didn't let live. The ink was smudged from her nervous grip, words shaky, lines crooked. She smoothed it flat across the desk and stared at it for a long while. Then a quiet laugh escaped her lips, not joy exactly, but something close. A strange cocktail of relief and disbelief. Maybe today hadn't been as bad as she thought. The next morning, she woke before her alarm, not from rest, but from restlessness. Her sleep had come in scattered fragments, interrupted by flashes of memory. The black car, the note trembling in her hand, the man's face under the soft amber glow of a streetlight. Their conversation had been brief, just a few exchanged words. but something about his gaze refused to leave her. It lingered like the hush before a storm, silent, yet expectant. She couldn't explain it, or maybe she just didn't dare believe it, that someone like him, a man who looked like he belonged in a world of tailored suits and decisive certainty, had looked at someone like her with something that wasn't pity and wasn't distance. It had been something closer, something real. The morning air was sharp and cold. She wrapped her thin jacket tighter around her frame, watching her breath curl into the mist like a ghost of what she hadn't said. She had planned to take the long way around, to avoid the parking lot entirely. She didn't know if she could handle the weight of seeing him again, not because she was afraid of him, but because she didn't know where to place someone like him in the fragile story of her life. But life, as always, had other plans. At the small cafe near the edge of campus, the one she stopped by most mornings for a moment of stillness, she saw him. Not by chance. He was already there, waiting, sitting at the farthest table, beneath a canopy of golden bulbs that hung like fireflies suspended in winter. He saw her first and lifted a hand. Not a wave, not a demand, just an open gesture, a quiet welcome, as if they had known each other once in some forgotten scene of a movie neither of them remembered watching. Her feet carried her forward before her mind could catch up. Her heartbeat picked up, not in fear, but in anticipation of something she couldn't yet name. "I had a feeling you'd take this route today," he said when she reached him. His voice was like wind threading gently through bare branches. "I didn't think a handwritten apology would keep me up all night." She looked down, unsure how to respond. Her fingers curled tighter around her backpack strap, but the silence between them was different this time. Not awkward, not heavy, just soft. Like music meant to be felt more than heard. He handed her a cup of warm milk coffee. "Did I get it right?" "I don't like bitter," she said with a small nod. "Neither do I." She looked at him, truly looked. For the first time, she let herself see past the coat, past the weathered lines. His face bore the soft edges of someone who had seen storms but never let them steal his gentleness. "I used to think honesty was automatic," he began, his voice quieter now. "That people would tell the truth simply because it was the right thing to do. But lately, I've realized it's becoming rare." She wasn't sure if he was talking about her or about something else entirely, but there was a quiet ache in his words, a sorrow for the parts of the world that were fading away without anyone noticing. "I just thought, if I pretended nothing happened, I wouldn't sleep," she said, speaking from the truest place she could find inside herself. He paused, then nodded slowly. "There was a time," he said, "when I left a note, too. I was younger. They didn't believe me, called me a vandal, said I was lying. After that, I stopped trying to explain myself." She stared at him, eyes wide, and in that instant, the space between them, age, experience, class, history, seemed to collapse. All that was left were two people, both marked by the pain of trying to do right and being met with the wrong kind of silence. "But yesterday," he continued, his voice softening like the end of a long breath, "I realized, if someone like you still does the right thing, maybe the things I used to believe in aren't gone after all." Her throat tightened, not out of sadness, not exactly, but because for the first time someone who didn't owe her anything had looked at her and trusted her, without question, without expectation. "My name's Caleb," he said after a pause. "I'm Laya." He repeated it, slowly, almost reverently, like the name held a kind of meaning he hadn't known he needed. "What do you do?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could second-guess it. "I used to make films," he said, smiling faintly. "Now, I'm trying to learn how to live again." She didn't fully understand what that meant, but somehow it didn't matter. Just like he didn't ask where she lived, or what she studied, or why she hadn't just walked away. Because between them, there was something better than understanding. There was recognition. "I didn't come to ask for money," he said finally. "I just wanted to say thank you. And if you'll let me, I'd like to buy you breakfast." "For scratching your car?" she asked, smiling, really smiling, for the first time that morning. "For reminding me," he said, "that sometimes the smallest things open the biggest doors." And so they sat there, beneath the cafe's awning, in the soft hush of early morning light. Two people who had once been strangers, now sharing a quiet sliver of the world over coffee. The warmth of the drinks in their hands mirrored something slower, deeper unfurling in the spaces between their words. They weren't friends, not yet. But they also weren't just strangers anymore. They were something rare. Two souls momentarily resting in the same gentle breath of life, where nothing needed to be explained, only felt. Later that day, Caleb took her somewhere he called the Forgotten World. It wasn't far, just a short walk past the main road tucked behind rows of brick buildings that time had quietly passed by. The place was an old cinema, its wooden sign faded and chipped, the glass door smeared with dust and years of unspoken stories. It smelled faintly of damp velvet and peeling paint, memories left behind by crowds who once came there seeking dreams and the flicker of light. "I used to work here," Caleb said as he gently pushed open the groaning door. "Back then I did everything. Cleaned the chairs, changed the bulbs, hung the posters. But every time a film played, I stood in the back corner and imagined I was the one who made it all happen." Laya stepped inside carefully, shrinking back slightly as the door creaked behind her. She didn't know why he brought her here, but she could feel it. This place held something sacred for him, something he had never shared aloud. "My first film premiered right here," Caleb said, his eyes drifting toward the dusty silver screen. It flopped. The critics tore it apart. Investors disappeared. And just like that, I lost almost everything. My confidence, my name, and parts of myself I didn't even know I'd given away. He took a seat in the center row, the kind of spot where sound hits you like a heartbeat. Laya sat beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough for the silence between them to mean something more than nothing. "You know what hurt the most?" he asked, voice low and measured. "It wasn't the failure. It was the silence afterward. No advice, no criticism. Just nothing. Like I'd never existed at all." Laya didn't respond. She didn't need to. She understood. That kind of silence, the absence of acknowledgement, is its own kind of cruelty, especially when it comes from those who once believed in you. "I got a few offers after that," he continued, voice distant, "but I turned them down. I was afraid of failing again, or worse, of finding out there was nothing left in me to lose." She looked at him, and in his quiet defeat, she saw pieces of herself. The fears she hadn't yet named, the moments she had stepped away from what she loved, not because she stopped caring, but because she couldn't face the risk of loving it and losing it anyway. Time passed, Caleb sighed. "I invested in real estate, stocks, whatever people called wise. I made money. They started calling me a millionaire. But every time I saw a blank screen, something inside me felt missing." She inhaled slowly. "Do you still have the script?" A small, sad smile touched his face. "I do, but I haven't opened it in years. I want to read it," she said, hesitant but sincere. "If you'll let me." He turned to her. Not surprised exactly, more like reminded. that even locked doors can be waiting, quietly, for someone to knock. "I thought I came here to thank you," he said, "but maybe you're the one reminding me that it's okay to begin again." "I don't know anything about filmmaking," she admitted shyly, "but I know what it feels like to be afraid. And if you wrote that story, maybe it deserves to be heard, even just by one person." For the first time in a long while, Caleb looked at someone who saw him, not through the lens of success or failure, but simply as a human being with something still worth saying. "Then you'll read it," he said, "but there's one condition." "What is it?" "Be honest. Even if you hate it, even if it's terrible, tell me the truth." She nodded without hesitation. Caleb rose and disappeared into the projection room. When he returned, he held a thick bundle of yellowed pages wrapped in a weathered folder. At the corner was a faded title, Scene 57, Waiting to be Rewritten. "Never wrote the ending," he whispered. "I was too scared to face it." Laya took the script in both hands. Her fingers trembled, not from the weight of the paper, but from what it carried, the hope, the heartbreak, the long years tucked into every typed word. She said nothing, just held it close like a quiet promise. That night, she barely slept. The manuscript sat open on her desk, beside a cold cup of tea and the soft flicker of a desk lamp. The pages still smelled like old dreams, worn but alive, like a letter never mailed. She didn't read it like a screenwriter. She had no training in acts or pacing. She read it the only way she knew how, with a tender, unguarded heart. The story was about a man who once lived through stories, but after a deep loss, drifted into the shadows of his past. He haunted old theaters, unfinished scripts, scenes left half-written, until one day a girl appeared, not to rescue him, but simply to listen. Scene 57, the final page, was blank. Only a faded note in the corner, to be rewritten, or maybe silence is enough. She read it over and over, not because she didn't understand it, but because it understood her. Laya tore a small piece of paper from her notebook, wrote a few lines, not as an editor, but as someone who heard the quiet and answered it. The next morning, she returned to the old theater. Caleb was already there, sitting in the cafe next door, an untouched espresso on the table. His face was the same, but this time it held the quiet expectancy of someone who dared to hope. "I thought you'd take a week," he said as she walked in. "I thought so too," Laya said softly, a gentle smile forming on her lips. She handed the manuscript back to Caleb, now with a small folded note tucked precisely between the pages of Scene 57. There were no annotations, no explanations, just a breath, quiet and intentional, left in exactly the place it needed to be. Caleb opened it. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of touching something that had been silent for far too long. The room held its breath. Nothing moved except the slow drift of light through the dusty window and the ticking of an old wall clock. "And if you believe silence is the final thing to say," the note read, "then I believe silence only matters when someone listens closely enough to realize it's not empty at all." He paused at the last line. His hand still rested on the page. "You wrote that?" he asked, though he already knew. "I did," she said quietly. "Because if you end your story with silence, some might think you have nothing left to say. But I believe you do. I think you're just afraid no one's listening." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He reread her words, not just with his eyes, but with something deeper, more vulnerable. When he finally looked up, his gaze had shifted. It wasn't just emotion anymore. It was reverence, gratitude, as if she had just returned to him a part of his soul he hadn't even realized was missing. "You have no idea what you just did," he said. "Not just for this story, for me." Laya bowed her head slightly and smiled. She didn't need to understand it all. It was enough to know that what she had written hadn't gone unheard. They left the cafe together. No more talk of scripts or endings, just quiet footsteps moving forward. Not as mentor and student or collaborators, but as two people who had once lived inside silence and were slowly learning to speak again. The tiny back room of the old cinema became their sanctuary. Not a formal office, not a proper workspace. Just a wooden table, two mismatched chairs, and the muted glow of sunlight filtering through a dusty window. But for Caleb and Laya, it was enough. Quiet enough for them to hear their own voices again. "It feels like I'm answering a question I never knew how to ask," Caleb whispered one afternoon, his pencil pausing over a half-formed sentence. "And every word I write feels like a step toward a house I thought was torn down long ago." The script began to change. It was no longer simply about a man who lost his passion. It became about two people, one who had forgotten how to speak, and one who had never believed her voice mattered. Together, they were learning to write the truths they had never dared admit, not even to themselves. Then one morning, as they were revisiting scene 57, once a blank page, now inked with tentative yet truthful lines, a man walked into the empty theater. His name was Marcus, a seasoned producer, silver-haired with a slow gait and eyes still sharp from decades in the business. He had worked with Caleb once, a lifetime ago, and he still visited the theater every weekend like a ritual. His quiet way of holding on to something sacred. "I heard someone's breathing life back into this place," Marcus said, his eyes settling on the stack of pages in Caleb's hands. "You writing again?" Caleb hesitated, not out of shame, but because he wasn't sure what they were doing could be called a return. "Not alone this time," he said, casting a quiet glance toward Laya, who was gently organizing the pages. Marcus picked up a few sheets and scanned them. No smile, no frown, just a long, thoughtful silence. Then his brow creased, not in disapproval, but in careful focus. "This line," he said, pointing midway down the page. "She write this?" "She helped me realize the story needed a new voice," Caleb replied. Marcus nodded slowly, his silence stretching long enough to matter. Then, without a word, he placed a business card on the table. "If you're both serious," he said, standing to leave, "call me. Maybe it won't become a film, but it deserves to be heard." After Marcus left, Caleb turned to Laya. Something had shifted in his expression. Soft and uncertain, but unmistakably brighter, like the sun trying to break through after a long storm. "You just reminded me of something," he said. "What's that?" "That it's not only the people with the biggest ideas who get to tell stories, it's the ones who believe their stories deserve to be told." Laya didn't say anything, but inside her, something rooted itself, a tender, tenacious seed of belief, small but strong, like the first green after a long winter. They didn't rush to call Marcus. They made no big plans. But from that day forward, they wrote more often, not for ambition, not for fame, but because the words had finally begun to find their way again. Weeks later, they sat in a conference room that felt cold despite its polished walls. Overhead, the fluorescent lights cast everything in sterile white, like emotions had no business there. Only numbers, only questions. Will it sell? Caleb sat at the head of the table. Across from him sat Marcus and two potential investors, one young and sleek, hair slicked back, eyes locked on a tablet. The other, older, with thick glasses and a coffee cup he kept sipping without ever seeming to swallow. I thought so too. Laya smiled gently, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady like a note held in quiet resolve. She handed the manuscript back to Caleb. Tucked into scene 57 was a small, carefully folded slip of paper. No explanation, no heading, just something breathed onto the page. like a final punctuation whispered into being. Caleb unfolded it slowly. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the sheer gravity of holding something so intimate, so long dormant. The kind of silence you don't break with sound, but with meaning. The room hushed around him. The only thing that moved was the slow trail of light across the floor, and the ticking of an old clock mounted on the wall, marking not time, but a moment being made. "And if you believe silence is the last thing worth saying," the note read, "then I believe silence only matters when someone listens deeply enough to know it isn't empty." He paused, eyes fixed on the line as if reading something sacred. "I wrote that," Laya said softly, "because if the story ends with silence, the audience might believe you had nothing left to say. But I think you still do. You're just afraid no one's listening." Caleb didn't respond right away. Instead, he read it again, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, something tender. When he looked up at her, there was a quiet shift in his gaze. Not just gratitude, but recognition, reverence, as though in that moment she'd returned a missing piece of him he hadn't even realized was lost. "You don't know what you just did," he murmured, "not just for the story, for me." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Some truths don't ask for acknowledgement. They simply land where they're meant to. They left the cafe side by side. No more talk of rewrites or endings. Just the stillness between two people who once lived inside their own silences, now walking forward through it together. The old projection booth at the back of the forgotten cinema became their shared space. No title plaque, no desks, just a wooden table, two creaky chairs, and soft afternoon light spilling through dusty windows. But for Caleb and Laya, it was enough. A kind of sacred quiet. Loud enough to hear yourself, and maybe each other. "It feels like I'm answering a question I didn't know how to ask," Caleb once said, his voice more thought than speech. "Like I'm walking toward a house I thought had burned down years ago." The script changed shape. It was no longer just a story about loss. It became something else. A map for healing, a duet written by two voices, one that had been silenced and one that had never dared to speak. Together, they were writing what they never could have written alone. Then one morning, as scene 57 slowly filled with trembling but honest words, the door creaked open. An older man stepped into the theater. Marcus. A veteran producer with silver hair, worn shoes, and eyes that missed nothing. He had worked with Caleb once, in a different life. He still came here sometimes, on weekends mostly, as if paying quiet homage to a dream he refused to let die. "He heard someone was breathing life back into this place," he said, eyes scanning the script in Caleb's hands. "You writing again?" Caleb hesitated, not from embarrassment but from truth. "Not alone," he said, glancing toward Laya, who was gently organizing the pages like she was piecing back a broken world. Marcus picked up a few pages, read. Brow furrowed, not from doubt, but from focus. He paused over a line. "She wrote this?" he asked, pointing. Caleb nodded. "She reminded me this story needs a new voice, a real one." A silence stretched long. Then Marcus, without another word, placed a business card on the table. "If you're serious, both of you, call me. Maybe it won't become a blockbuster, but it deserves to be heard." After Marcus left, Khalid looked at Laya. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something close. "You reminded me of something. That not only those with the biggest ideas get to tell stories, but those who believe their stories deserve to be told." She didn't answer. But inside her something unfurled. Soft, green, tender. The first bloom after a long, brutal winter. They didn't rush to call Marcus. No emails, no pitches. They simply wrote, more consistently, more truthfully. Not chasing success, just chasing the sound of their own voices finally rising. Weeks later, they sat in a meeting room lit too brightly. The walls were sterile, the light clinical. Emotions had no place here. Only data, only questions. Will it sell? Caleb sat at the head of the table. Beside him, Laya, hands folded in her lap, palms damp with sweat. She'd prepared everything. Structure, themes, emotional arcs. She even had references to films that lingered long after the credits rolled. But nothing could have prepared her for the silent judgment in that room, the kind that doesn't bite, but presses, like a teacher about to call on you when you're not ready. The current ending, it's vague, said the young investor. Audiences today need clarity. A hug, a kiss, a promise of something more. Caleb opened his mouth, but Laya spoke first. Her voice was soft, but it didn't waver. Because this isn't a story about endings. Everyone turned. She swallowed, then steadied herself. People don't need a kiss to believe someone's going to be okay. What they need is to see someone who gave up, choose to rise again. A girl who thought she was invisible, finally finding her voice. The older investor furrowed his brow. So you want to end on a monologue? No visual payoff? Not all clarity has power, Laya replied. Sometimes the power is in what's left unsaid. Caleb looked at her then, not to intervene, not to rescue, but to witness. Because for the first time she wasn't speaking for him. She was speaking for the story. Their story. This isn't an action film, she continued. It's a film about the internal. About small things. A scratched car, a note, an unfinished script. The moments we think don't matter are the ones that change everything. Silence. Then Marcus smiled. Barely noticeable, but it was there. The kind of smile that said, I remember why I started. We don't just invest in what we know will sell, Marcus said. We invest in what might move someone. The younger investor hesitated, nodded. The older one said nothing, but he didn't object. On the way home, they walked in silence. The air had shifted. Autumn was slipping into winter. The wind had turned colder. I used to think my job was to protect this story, Caleb said, eyes on the pavement. But today, I realized, it's not mine anymore. Laya didn't answer. She didn't need to. She felt it in her chest, the steadiness in her voice when she spoke up. It hadn't come from strength, but from knowing. If she didn't speak for this story, no one else would. I'm proud of you, Caleb said quietly. She looked ahead. Streetlights flickered on, casting golden halos through the branches above. No music, no applause, just stillness. The kind only those who've known fear recognize. The stillness after you've stepped through it. She was no longer the girl who left a trembling note beneath a windshield wiper. She was the one writing the ending, not just of the script, but of her own story. Twilight settled softly over the world, like it was preparing for something sacred, without needing to announce it. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting golden light on the narrow street where the old cinema still stood, quiet, but never forgotten. There was no red carpet, no cameras, no gowns. Just a chalkboard out front, in soft white script. Tonight, one story, two hearts, countless silences. Laya stood before the entrance in a soft blue dress, her hair pulled back, her notebook clutched to her chest, the one where she had written Scene 57. Her heart pounded, not from fear of failure, but because, for the first time, she felt seen, truly seen, in every word, every frame. Inside, Caleb adjusted the projector one last time. Under the amber glow, he was no longer a man hiding behind faded fame. In his eyes was something else, tender, alive, as if a part of him had just come home. Only 30 people came. Old friends, a few colleagues. The cafe barista, the theater guard, with the keys hanging from his belt like relics. When the screen lit up, Laya held her breath. The film lasted just under an hour. No special effects, no shocking twists, no explosive climax. Just still frames, sparse dialogue, and an ocean of silence. But in that silence, something stirred. In the scene where the man stood alone in the empty theater, facing a blank screen, Caleb had chosen the perfect angle, the very one he had described the day he spoke of his first failure. In the shot where the girl placed the note beneath a windshield wiper, the camera didn't move. It stayed still, still enough to capture breath, wind, and the trembling of unseen kindness. Then the ending, not a scene, but a voice, a woman's voice, soft and smoky. Not everyone has the courage to speak, but if someone's listening, even silence becomes a language. The screen went dark. No applause, just a few quiet sighs, a stifled sniffle. And from the back row, someone whispered, "That was me, once." Laya looked over at Caleb. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. Every word had already been spoken. Through each frame, through every silence the film had gently offered. After the screening, guests gathered in the small courtyard behind the old theater. The setup was simple, a folding table with a pot of tea, plates of cookies, and string lights hung above like stars lowered just enough to feel close. A longtime friend of Caleb's clinked a teacup with Laya's. "This story... it felt real," he said with a knowing smile. "Thank you for not giving it an easy ending." A woman, middle-aged, a stranger, gently took Laya's hand. "I was silent for many years," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Watching this, I saw myself." Laya didn't know what to say. She simply smiled, quietly, like wind passing through leaves. Later, when the courtyard had emptied and the soft hum of voices faded into the night, Caleb sat on the old stone steps just outside the entrance. His shoes were dusted with the stillness of the evening. Laya joined him, resting gently against his shoulder. Still, not a word passed between them. None were needed anymore, because what needed to be told had been told, fully, honestly, with nothing forced, nothing held back. "I've been thinking," Laya said, her voice barely above the hush of streetlights humming overhead. "If someone asked me if this was an ending or a beginning, what would I say?" Caleb smiled, eyes fixed on the sky. Above them, stars blinked softly, like old hopes waiting patiently to be named. "I'd say it doesn't really matter as long as we keep writing." They stayed there like that, two people sitting quietly between city light and open sky, not waiting for the story to close, just being part of it, because the most important parts had already been spoken. In the gentlest way possible. The next morning the season shifted. Rain fell without warning, the kind that just arrives without introduction. Laya sat by her desk near the window, a steaming cup beside her, next to the little cactus she'd kept alive through the chaos and the warm amber glow of her reading lamp. On the desk lay the final printed version of the script. The old title was gone. Now it said simply, Scene 57. She had rewritten the ending, not because an investor asked, not to appease an audience, and certainly not for critical approval, but because something quiet and resolute had risen within her. A voice she could no longer ignore, one that whispered, "This story deserves to be told," in the softest, most honest way it knows how. In this version, the female lead doesn't say much. No one confesses love. There are no dramatic camera spins, no swelling music cues. She simply sits in a small cafe, opens an old notebook, and begins to write. Not for publication, not for anyone, just for herself. To finally give words to the silence that once held her hostage. That same morning, Caleb sat alone in the darkened theater. No audience, no soundtrack, just the rhythmic flicker of the projector behind him and the pages of the screenplay in his hands. He read every word like breathing in an old memory, freshly awakened. And when he reached the final line, he paused, not because he didn't understand it, but because he understood it completely. We don't get to choose when a story begins, but we can always rewrite the ending. It was only a sentence, but to Caleb, it wasn't just a line of dialogue. It was forgiveness, a greeting, a door reopening to all the possibilities still waiting on the other side. A few days later, Laya traveled home to visit her parents. She brought the script, not to show off, but simply to place it on the bookshelf in her childhood room. A quiet act, but one rich with meaning. A reminder that something she once believed she'd never finish was now whole. Her mother glanced at it and smiled warmly. "You used to write journal entries on the back of bread wrappers. Now look at you, an entire film." Laya laughed softly, running a hand along the spine of the script. "I'm just writing down the things that used to scare me." On another quiet afternoon, Caleb invited her for a walk in the park. Back to where it all began. The trees stood bare now, their leaves surrendered to the season. The bench where she once sat, shaking as she wrote her apology, had been freshly painted, cleaner, brighter. "You know," Caleb said, "I used to think endings were sad." Laya nodded. "Maybe that's because you didn't wait long enough to see them come full circle." She paused, then added, "An ending isn't where a story dies. It's where it stops needing explanation." They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. No grand romantic gestures, just peace. In their exchanged glances, in their steady steps, lived the quiet truth that everything had finally landed where it was meant to. Winter crept in, gently. One early morning, Laya sat by the window again, a pen in her hand. Not for a script this time, but a letter. "Dear the one who once believed they weren't enough. There was a time when I thought a scratch meant something was ruined, but now I understand. It's where the light comes in first. Thank you for stopping to read the note I left that day. Without you, this story might never have started." If this were a movie, the final frame would be of a girl sitting quietly in a sunlit room, light falling diagonally across the wooden floor, her hand resting on a blank page. No music, just sound of a pen meeting paper, like the soft breath of someone finally brave enough to tell their story. And that story, it isn't over. It's just been rewritten in a completely new way. So if you've ever felt like the small things you do go unnoticed, remember this. Sometimes a simple apology can rewrite an entire life. And if you've made it here, if you've listened to this story all the way through, leave a like, a comment, or share it with someone who might need the gentle reminder that kindness always speaks, even in silence. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Moments of Quiet Truth, where we walk together through stories that seem small but leave the loudest echoes in the heart.